Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner, and I want to welcome all of our participants and our guests and Jane Farady, my co-host, to our webinar. We had taken a hiatus, but a lot of things have happened since our last webinar. We're continuing our webinars. We're a community of concerned parents, professionals, and still learning how to deal with this COVID-19 health emergency, which is having glimmers of light and hope down the road. And I hope next year is going to be better than this year and certainly last year. We've been moderating a series of webinars to address issues that have come up with this unprecedented time, where students are physically in school, on distance learning, or a combination. We're all dealing with degrees of anxiety that are unprecedented as well. We appreciate your questions, and at the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A format. We would prefer that you use the Q&A format and not the chat, and I'll explain that in a moment. My co-host is Jane Farady, who's the director of the Jumpstart program at the Jewish Community Center in Stamford. She's also an educational advocate, and she will be moderating tonight's discussion. We're especially pleased to have our guest, Dr. Michael Cohen, who's a licensed clinical psychologist. His office is based in Fairfield, Connecticut. The reason I'm mentioning Connecticut, I'm finding out that we have an international community, people from the UK, Canada, other places besides the lower 48 states in the United States. So we're not only reaching people here in Connecticut, but I want to add a disclaimer that I'm licensed to practice in Connecticut. Dr. Cohen, I believe, is licensed to practice in New York and Connecticut, as I recall. We have a variety of topics to go over this evening. All with this time of the year, we're dealing with end of the year annual review, PPT meetings, reviewing the 2020-21 school year, getting ready for the summer if the summer program is part of an IEP, and planning for the next school year, the 22-23 school, 21-22 school year, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. We have a bunch of topics to go over with Dr. Cohen. We have several questions that have been sent in ahead of time. I just want to give an additional disclaimer. This webinar is being recorded. And because it's being recorded, the information in the chat section is part of the recording, but the Q&A questions are not. And speaking of the chat section, you'll see all of our contact information, Dr. Michael Cohen, attorney Lawrence Berliner, and Jane Farady, not in that order of importance, but that's how it shows up on my screen. The information provided during this webinar does not constitute specific legal advice to you or your child and should not be relied upon such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with attorney Berliner, myself, nor does it establish a doctor-patient relationship with Dr. Michael Cohen. By signing up, you've agreed to receive information about future webinars and events from the Stamford Jewish Community Center, the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. This is a Zoom format, and Zoom is a third-party provider and is not an agent or associated with the Stamford Jewish Community Center, Dr. Michael Cohen, or the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. We would prefer your questions be as general in nature, so all participants, and we have many this evening, can benefit from the question and the answer. Let's see. Let me just introduce Dr. Cohen, and then we'll have Jane give an introduction. Dr. Cohen is a graduate of the Harvard University School of Education, where he received his first of 2 master's degree in counseling, and went on to the University of California at Berkeley, where he received a second master's degree in educational psychology, and eventually his PhD in educational psychology. He's a board certified rehabilitation psychologist, certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology. He has proficiency in personality assessments, member of the Society for Personality Assessments, if I have that correctly. He's a board certified school neuropsychologist, and he's a member of the American Board of School Neuropsychology. As I mentioned before, he's licensed here in Connecticut as well as New York as a clinical psychologist and as a credentialed school psychologist, which is, I think, a State Department of Education designation. What I didn't know about Dr. Cohen is at one point in this career, he was a special education teacher in New York City, and he's managed to survive and come here from that part of his career. So without further ado, I'd like Jane Farady to introduce herself, and then we will get to the topics of tonight's webinar.
I feel very privileged to be here tonight with Dr. Michael Cohen. I have a number of clients that have worked with Michael over the years, and they've really appreciated the support and expertise that he's offered. And it's a pleasure to be back with Lawrence again after our little break. So I am the director of a program called Jumpstart, located in the Stamford JCC. We predominantly support children typically aged between 2 and 3 with developmental disabilities. And we try to give them the opportunity to have a fun preschool experience while supporting their individual needs. And we collaborate with their birth to 3 teams and any therapists that might be working with them. I then help them transition into the public school and support them beyond that as well. We're also lucky at the JCC, we do have a summer camp called Hand in Hand, where we are inclusive, but we are able to support children from age 3 through to 9th or 10th grade, either in a 1-to-1 capacity or a 2-to-1, depending upon their individual needs. And I also work with STAR, and we have a program called Jump Stars, where we provide social, educational, such as this webinar, and recreational activities for parents to come together. We have been virtual up to this point, but if you go to our Facebook page, you'll see that we have some fun in-person activities done at a socially safe distance outside for the month of May. So take and we look forward to meeting some of you in person at that point. But everything is sponsored by Jump Stars, and it's an opportunity for you to take some time for yourself. I think COVID has taught each of us as parents that we are unable to support those that we care for without also taking care of ourselves and our own physical as well as mental and emotional well-being. And I think that's a nice segue to talk to Michael. So Michael, obviously this has been a very difficult time for everybody, parents and children alike. If you would like to share some of the trends and things that you've noticed while working during this time, that would be great.
Well, first I'd like to say thank you to Attorney Berliner and yourself. It's a real pleasure to be here, and hopefully everyone can hear me well. As everyone knows, it really has been a hard year for all of us, and especially for some of our most vulnerable children. I remember last 12 months ago when we didn't know what was going to happen, and we were just finishing up a series of IEPs on my part with children in school, and we were thinking, boy, we'll just be back in about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And a year later, we're struggling to return to a new way of doing things. Some children are back in school. Some children and their families have chosen distance learning for their children. Some have hybrided. They all have certain health advantages and disadvantages. And they all have had different psychological advantages and disadvantages for children. But I do think many children are quite resilient in how they've responded. But some of our most fragile children have had some more distinct difficulties over the past year. So I will turn it over to questions, and I welcome all questions, please.
So what age group children do you typically work with in your office currently?
So I'm a private practice psychologist. Children who have significant early onset disabilities from birth or in the infancy or early years can get served through Birth to 3, which are usually very good, excellent programs. I start to see children in my practice as young as 3 years old. My office is really set up to work with children as young as 3. In some cases, I'll do a little bit of consulting with younger children and their families. And I do endorse the Birth to 3 programs. They really are quite quality and good programs. I'll start to see preschool age children in my practice for a range of concerns. And the majority of my school practice are children from 5 to 18 years old, with some children who are eligible for special services up through 21, 22 years old. And so I really see a whole range of children. I see children with a whole range of special needs. And that's the other side of the practice, is not all child is the same, and they all have very unique needs. And even if they share a diagnosis or if they share a educational classification, they might respond similarly, and they might have their own special way of doing things. So I really work very hard with families and with schools to tailor programs that fit the child's needs and advance his, her, or their educational development. And that's really the goal.
So on that note, you must make a wonderful partner when it comes to an IEP, which, as Lawrence knows, is about individualizing a child's educational experience when attending school. So do you have any recommendations or particular strategies or techniques that you use to support the parents through designing and developing an appropriate, and Lawrence concerned to what is maybe considered appropriate in an IEP scenario?
That really is an excellent question. So I will have children who are at the start of their educational journey in terms of special education, and I'll have children who are midstream, and children who are fortunate and they get exited from services because they no longer need special services. So each one of them have very unique needs. The initial assessments are usually very comprehensive. Whether I do it, if a school district provider does it, it's more of a team assessment, and they should be very comprehensive and look at what the referral questions are. But they should also look at not just what either the classroom teacher's referral question is or the parent's referral question is. Determined psychology is differential diagnosis. There are other things that may present for the child. So we should always have an open mind to say, well, what are the issues here? If a child is acting out and reactive and they're having some difficulty with some potential behavioral distress, are they angry? Are they unhappy? Those are two slightly different ways of dealing with children, and they might require different assessment techniques, and they might require, more importantly, different intervention techniques, whether the interventions are provided independently through private practice practitioners like myself, whether the interventions are then school-based by school support staff. And so it's really important to really have a foundation understanding of who the child is that you are going to be working with, what that child's special needs might be, and then to have a broad enough view to say, what else might it be? Or is there something else here that we can help this child with, or this family with? So I really try, most of my colleagues really try to take a very broad-based approach. And then once we start working with a child, we do two things. We actually narrow the assessment to the child's very specific needs. But in some cases, we also broaden the assessment to say, what needs might they have when they go to school? What needs might they have when they're in their household or in their home community? So we try to take an open-ended approach, but we also try to be very specific, tailoring the assessment to what that very specific child might require.
do you approach this time of the year, the second half of the school year differently than the first half? Because often this time of the year, we have end of the year PPT meetings, annual review. Is there something you might do as an evaluator differently at the beginning of the school year versus, halfway, 3/4 of the way through the school year, as far as preparing for an annual review PPT?
Excellent question. So that's an excellent question. Sorry. That's an excellent question. Usually again, when a child comes to private practice, it's usually a broad-based assessments. And it usually, depending on the child's age and developmental needs and psychiatric needs, the assessment is usually, in my practice, 4 to 7, 8, or 9 hours. And usually assessments in my practice are 7 to 9 hours worth of clinical work with a child, usually testing, mental health interviews. The second part of the question for Mr. Berliner is, there is some expedient need at the end of the year in dealing with IEPs. And in some cases, you want to do a very specific, targeted, direct assessment that answers a very specific inquiry, a very specific educational question, so you can get the clinical information to the school team quickly. So that is a factor, but in most cases, most of us usually try to give a broad, well-based assessment. And again, a lot of that has to do with what the referral question is. Sometimes it's a smaller referral question. Sometimes it's a slightly larger referral question. And then sometimes you'll say, we're going to start the assessment because we have to get the child into the special ed system. We have to do an update for his or her IEP. And then we'll say, we'll finish the assessment over the summer. So that would be the one real clinical difference in how to do that. The other side of it is, so sometimes I'll do a lot of neuropsychological exams, which are very comprehensive and broad-based. Sometimes I'll get a much more specific assessment question to complete an autism or a diagnostic mental health assessment. And those are usually a little bit shorter in duration for the child. They're usually one session, and those can be turned around fairly quickly.
Are there certain kinds of evaluations that you generally use, some that you use under specific circumstances? I mean, for example, a cognitive test is not a cognitive test, because they're different cognitive tests. So why would you choose one over the other? The same for achievement, same for rating scales.
Excellent question. I tend to, if I'm doing assessments, child valued by the school fairly recently, I will work around their assessments. So if the school district gave a cognitive test called the Wechsler scale or a cognitive test called the Woodcock-Johnson, I'll use the other alternate form. So I'll work around what schools do frequently. There are a few tests that you can actually overlap with, and I think it's important to do that. I'll overlap the test. But I always refer to it like Coke and Pepsi or Ford and GM. There are different versions of very similar tests. And so if I'm going to give a Wechsler intelligence scale, I also like to give the Wechsler academic achievement scale. I like to pair the two together personally. They were normed and developed together. It's not an absolute requirement, but I do like to do that. So if I'm giving the Woodcock-Johnson tests, I would prefer to give the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive assessments and then follow it up with the Woodcock-Johnson academic assessments if I'm doing academic testing. And then you diversify. You go into some memory tests if memory is an issue. A lot of the children I work with have very overt memory issues or subtle but impairing memory issues. And we always forget when we talk about learning disabilities. A learning disability, depending on what kind it is at its foundation a memory issue. Dyslexia, for example, is a memory disorder. You don't necessarily remember how to match letters and sounds together to make words. It actually comes back to memory. So there are ways of looking at how children remember and understand. We look at verbal memory, we look at visual spatial memory, we look at procedural memories. Most of us adults know how to pick up a pen and write a sentence fairly easily. That's a pretty automatic procedural skill for an adult. If you have an adult who's had a stroke, they have to go through rehabilitation to relearn necessarily, if they had a stroke that affects their motor skills, how to relearn how to write, for example. children are learning how to write. They're learning the procedures. It's a very labor-intensive endeavor for kids. Most children do it relatively easily. The children that we think might have learning disabilities or other forms of disability, it's a more difficult endeavor. So you have to sort of figure out what you're looking at, and then you pair the assessment with the endeavor. I am doing a lot of executive functioning testing these days, the ability to plan, self-regulate, organize oneself, simple activities, remembering to put your homework in your backpack is both a memory and an executive function task. But procedurally, knowing the steps of a math equation or knowing when to get ready for a class to end. These are procedural tasks, knowing the materials that you might require. A lot of the children I work with can be impulsive, knowing what not to do, how not to impulse on something, how to inhibit a response. These are all executive tasks. So broad answer, but yes, we do a lot of looking at a lot of tests.
One part of your report and any other evaluator report, private evaluators, I should say, are recommendations, professional recommendations for a student based upon your test findings, clinical interview, an analysis. What do you do to implement the recommendations if, say, you're participating in a PPT meeting, a pupil planning team meeting?
As an outside evaluator, that's probably the trickiest part of the job, quite frankly. And it really comes down to using the science of the assessment, making sure the assessment is accurate to what the child needs. If you're doing a learning disability assessment, to correctly identify where the child's learning disability is. If you're doing an autism assessment, to see how the child is affected by his or her autism disability. We spent a lot of time writing prescriptive recommendations, and it really is coming down to explaining the need of the child in the PPT. We say this child comes to us and they have these problems with either copying from the blackboard, staying focused in a non-preferred learning activity. So a lot of the children I work with have preferred classes that they like, and some classes that are very difficult for them to stay focused and seated. And so we say, well, we know this child may have some listening difficulties in certain settings. We know he or she might have some motor impairments. Let's take a look at and really make these very mechanical skills very specific, take where the child is, and then say, how can we advance this child's learning? But in going back to Mr. Berliner's question, the real trick is persuasion, being careful, being child-centered always, and linking what the child is showing clinically to the difficulty he or she is having in the classroom, and then saying, well, these are the steps we think might be helpful for this child. But the biggest trick is we are advisory. We have no authority within a school district. So the authority that we have is the accuracy of our recommendations.
That links to one of the questions that we had earlier in a way. Somebody asked, how does a parent coordinate care between the therapist, the psychologist, the pediatricians, and whoever else might be involved with the child's care to help obtain a better IEP, even with permission for one entity to speak to another entity? It never seems to be coordinated effort to determine what is best for the child. How easy is it for you to develop a rapport with the school so that they really understand the time that you've taken to diagnose a child or the child through treatment? And then how successful have you been at helping the school then shape the child's educational experience based upon your expertise?
It's a complex endeavor. I think one of the things that a psychologist can do well, whether it's a private practice psychologist like myself or the school psychologist in the school, is they really can oversight and coordinate services and interactions very well. Psychologists, whether they're private psychologists or school psychologists, usually have relationships with the child. If it's a school psychologist, they usually have relationships with the providers in the school setting. A private psychologist like myself, I work with many of the therapists who see children, whether they're a mental health therapist, whether they are a occupational therapist or a speech language therapist or a physical therapist. I frequently coordinate with medical providers, psychiatrists, neurologists, other medical specialists that children use. And so a good psychologist should work to integrate all this information well. And as an outside provider, so Mr. Berliner has seen a few of my reports, I spend a lot of time in the history portion of a report because that really lays the foundation for the recommendations for first the assessment that I'll do, hopefully, and then the recommendations that I'll make. And so I like speaking to school psychologists. I like speaking to school speech language pathologists because same numbers a lot. I frequently ask to speak to the administrator before a meeting and to say, these are the issues I'm going to see that are coming up. And, I always ask the opportunity to present the findings I have. I always ask for them to be considered. I'm always open to someone having a better idea than me. That's the part of working with a good team. If someone else can do something that's equally good, that's a little bit different, that works within that school setting, great to me. I'm there to help the child. I don't always expect that every recommendation I offer will be accepted by the school. I hope they are, but if the school can have alternate recommendations that serve the child, that's certainly fine to me. Again, I'm not invested in being the only one with all the correct recommendations. I'm invested in having services for the child. And there are times where schools disagree with what I might ask for or what a family might ask for. And what I ask in those situations is for the schools to be understanding. Again, no one has to agree with everyone 100% of the time, but I do ask that they are considerate and respectful of the needs of the child. And if I can frame those needs well, I'm usually at an advantage to advocate for what that child might need. But I spend a lot of time on the phone with different providers. I spend a lot of time with families, both in my office. I spend a lot of time on the intake with families when they make their first phone call to me. I'll usually spend about 40 minutes to an hour with a family when they make their first phone call to me. And then I'll spend time speaking with the child's outside providers, and I will spend a little bit shorter time because I know school providers have just less time. They really are quite busy these days, but I do try to make an effort to speak with usually a school psychologist or speech pathologist. And when I can, I'll be very grateful to speak to a classroom teacher, or I'll be very grateful to speak to the special ed teacher, because they're the ones who know the child the best in schools.
We had a question as part of your assessments when you're evaluating a student for various learning disabilities such as dyslexia and dysgraphia. Do you yourself do formal assessments, or do you refer a family or a child when there are graphomotor issues, visual motor?
Oh, I apologize. Can you say that one more sentence again?
What's that?
Can you say that one last sentence again? Can you repeat that? I broke up just a little bit.
Graphomotor, visual motor, ocular motor issues that may be overlapping or coexisting with a learning disability. So
I will quite frequently, I do motor assessments in my practice. So many children who have, I had IQ tests, the Wechsler scales, or have had the Woodcock-Johnson tests. There are motor components in those assessments. And if they highlight any level of concern, I will absolutely build in a motor assessment. I tend to use a test called the Bender Gestalt. The BRE VMI is a popular one that's used as well. My OT friends have other visual motor assessments that they use. Many of the neuropsychological packages, such as the NEPSI, have motor components to them. Many of the kids I work with who have specific learning disabilities, dyslexia, reading, writing disorders, frequently have impaired handwriting. And you see it in a few ways when I'm doing an assessment. If they have difficulty with a coding subtest, that's an indicator of a quick writing deficit. I actually look very closely at their penmanship. If I have a child who's writing his or her name poorly at age 7 or 8, that's a worry for me. I look at my 4th and 5th graders. Does their penmanship and handwriting, two things I'll look at. the speed of writing, because the productivity demands are really quite excessive. We don't really realize how much our children do in school every day. And I even though it's not a formal diagnosis, I frequently say that many of the children I work with have a productivity disorder. They can't keep up. They are trying to write and the teachers are racing already. So I look at the forms they write, the precision of their ability to complete forms and letters and words, spacing. But I also look at the speed of the mechanics. And if you're having a fourth grader who's having either speed issues or mechanical issues with his or her writing, you're going to have a child who's struggling in school, without a doubt. They're going to feel like they're always a step behind. They can't keep pace. The teacher is finished her sentence and has gone to the next topic, or they're starting to erase from the blackboard. And boy, that's a very tricky, disheartening experience for children. So whether we call it dyslexia, whether we call it a specific learning disorder in reading or written expression, kids who have not become automatic by fourth grade in their learning are really at a marked handicap. And that's really one of the indicators of either a writing disorder or a generic reading disorder, even before we start talking about things like dyslexia. So I will absolutely put in motor assessments. I put in timed reading assessments into my examinations. I put in language and listening assessments. If a child has very good receptive comprehension on a listening activity and they are struggling with comprehension on a reading activity, that's a really good indicator that that child might have a comprehension or other based reading disorder. So you really take all these bits of information and you're creating a portrait of that child's learning skills.
I think what you just touched upon is also that you're able to tap into the perspective of the child. You mentioned that if a child isn't able to keep up, how that child might be feeling at that time. And that's really critical to everybody's well-being, how we feel about ourselves. And one of the questions we received before this evening was, can you recommend coping skills for an 11-year-old, for example, with anxiety about too many school assignments and at times he lacks confidence?
So there are two levels of that question. There's the child level and there's the school level. And I would absolutely speak to, if the child's not special ed, I would speak to his or her classroom teacher. If the child isn't special ed, I would certainly speak to a classroom teacher. And usually children have case managers who oversight their cases in school. And I think the best way of starting is to have a conversation with the teacher or the case manager. They may not realize that the child is struggling to keep up if they're struggling to both teach the child in the classroom, the other 10 or 20 children in the classroom, and struggling with the distance learning that the teachers quickly had to learn how to do. So the first step is actually speaking to the classroom teacher, the case manager, seeing what simple steps, maybe doing a little bit of a reduction in the volume, not the quality of work. I want to be clear about this. The volume of work, not the higher level quality. You want the child to do his or her high level quality work all the time. But for some children, it might be 7 math questions instead of 10. It might be 5 spelling questions instead of 15. So you have to be really careful about that. The other side of the question, and then as Mr. Berliner knows, you can actually write informal accommodations into IEPs or 504 plans, and some children require that. The other side of that is actually the real sensitive side, is speaking to your child. Sometimes they're very clear, especially with slightly older children, where they're having difficulties. Frequently, they're embarrassed or ashamed or angry, and they don't know how to say it well. And so you see changes in behavior in children, especially elementary school age kids. If they start getting a little bit withdrawn, a little bit more agitated before going to school. If it seems like they're spending, if the teacher says they should spend 20 minutes on an assignment and they're spending now 45 minutes on an assignment, they're doing 2 things. They're procrastinating to avoid the assignment, and they're also having struggles with the academic portion of the assignment. I think it's important for families to speak to their children about how they're learning in school, how they feel about their learning, how their friends perceive them, how they perceive their friends. There are simple things you can do in school, at home, I like simple relaxation exercises for kids. I put in actually yoga a lot or meditation into my reports, and there's actually research validation for that. High intensity sports are great. I think they're a great release. We don't let kids run and jump at all enough in this past year. That has been a terrible loss for many children. They don't get to run and jump enough and play with their friends. And if there are even more concerns after that, you can reach out to your family pediatrician. When we had some concerns in my household, we actually called our family pediatrician about what we were seeing with concerns for our child. We are fortunate in Connecticut. We have great providers who provide mental health services. I do think a pediatrician's office is a great place to start. Speaking to your school psychologist, they know providers in the community. There are great places, great people to start, providers to start with. There are lots of programs like this. You can get different referral sources offline afterwards, not during, but offline afterwards. You can find out different contacts. And there are lots of parent listservs that you can get good providers. We're very fortunate here. There are lots of good mental health providers. There are lots of good speech and language providers, excellent physical therapists and OT providers. So we have a resource here. Speak to friends, speak to family members, but reach out to a provider. Most providers will do an intake with you. They might be the appropriate provider, or they might say they have a colleague who would be a better provider for your child. And most of the people who go into these services want to be helpful. And I think it's an okay thing. I think most children, young people, once they might be initially reactive and angry or sad or scared, most of the time they find it as a relief. Once they start going to a good therapist or a good speech pathologist, they feel relieved. They like going. It validates them. So that's really one of the things I would do, is start with either your pediatrician, a school mental health provider, a school psychologist. But we have great resources here, and spend time with your child. Ask them what their worries are. We don't spend enough time asking our own children what their own fears and what their own worries are. And their fears and worries might be quite different than what we have. And so what you know.
I was going to say, as a parent, that's the real challenge for a lot of my parents, is that they are then very worried about their child. They see their child struggling academically. They see their child struggling emotionally, socially, anxiety, depression, and some of those behaviors that spiral from those feelings the child has. And then it's then very difficult as a parent to take a step back yourself, take the breath that you need, and to then provide successful strategies for your child. Do you have any recommendation for parents on how to support their child when their child is really at a heightened state emotionally or suffering, and how to support their child through it while also taking care of their own energy status at that moment? That's the real challenge as a parent. When
and boy, that is one of the biggest challenges of the past year. And I think one of the things to do is to listen. It's hard to listen. Take a moment, take 5 minutes, and say, what can you tell me about your day? It's really a tricky thing. Validate that math might be tricky, and it's okay. That's tricky. We're not all good at everything. It's that's who we are. It makes us special and wonderful. Parents frequently, when we talk about parents, we're talking about the most important person in their life frequently. We're talking about their child. And parents, I know, will do anything they can think of that is appropriate to help their child. And sometimes I actually tell parents, it's okay not to know all the answers. It's okay to take your time. It's okay to not rush into something. I think one of the things we have struggled with is we don't like seeing our child in any distress, and we want to solve that question right away. Sometimes the questions take a week to answer. Sometimes they take 6 months to answer. Sometimes even longer, depending what the question is, and depending on who the child is. And I think being patient with your child, which is not always easy. I struggle. I have 3 daughters. I struggle with it sometimes myself. But to be patient, to be kind, to listen. We don't spend enough time doing those very simple things. And then the other side is not to feel that you have to do it alone. We have great resources here in Connecticut of all different kinds. It's okay to reach out for them. And most of the very good providers that I work with are very happy to listen and just say, even if they can't help that family, you're doing well here. And to just validate in how they're doing, because it is really hard. And it is, if you have a child who's not doing well in school, it can feel very isolating for the child, and it can feel very isolating for the family.
I'm going to do a lightning round legal questions and give Dr. Cohen a minute or so to regroup. We had a couple of legal questions outside, I guess, the purview of Dr. Cohen, so I'll do my best with 2 of them. In effect, what is the difference between transitioning from an IEP to a 504 plan? There are differences. 504 plans are about reasonable accommodations. There's no direct instruction. The procedural safeguards are different than the special education procedural safeguards. An IEP, you have direct instruction, you have goals and objectives, periodic reports of progress, periodic evaluations like triennial evaluations, a comprehensive set of procedural safeguards, which I might add, if the State Department of Education has just released a brand new booklet entitled Procedural Safeguards the end of last month. It's far more readable and user-friendly than the ones that you've been receiving. Go to the State Department of Education website, ct.gov, and make sure you have the latest version of procedural safeguards. The other one, so there are advantages for having a 504 plan if you only need 5 accommodations, but if you need direct instruction, there are advantages to having an IEP. So a parent should make that kind of decision carefully, possibly with the guidance of a psychologist to see, because special ed is not supposed to be forever. If your child has gained skills, the gaps have closed, maybe they just need accommodations. If they're going off to college, for example, there are no IEPs in college, but there are accommodations. So there are differences between the IEP and 504 plans. The other legal question dealt with an IEP that has a student supposed to go to school 5 days a week, but is in fact going less than 5 days a week. There is what's called an Iep Implementation Plan. That was a concept that came out last March or April, thereabouts. It's still in effect now. The COVID-19 pandemic did not change the free appropriate public education standard. The implementation plan is not a way to modify the IEP. That can only be done at a PPT meeting. So what the implementation plan is saying to the parent, your child is going to get 5 days a week of services. Some of those services might be in person at school, maybe 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And some of those services might be that's the hybrid model. And some of those would be online or virtual learning. If you don't have an IEP implementation plan, if your IEP is not being followed, then first thing to do is try an informal conversation or meeting with the school staff. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. If that's not the case, request a formal PPT meeting to have the IEP as written implemented. And if that's not effective, the State Department of Education has an informal complaint resolution procedure called Complaint Resolution Procedure, CRP. That information is also available on the State Department of Education website, ct.gov, because the IEP as written should be delivered. How it's being delivered might differ with the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has to be delivered.
I have another question that was submitted that's both legal and possibly psychological twist to it as well. Based on general experience of families, roughly when should a middle schooler who's not aware he has an IEP be informed and included in the PPT process? This example, for example, the child might be academically high performing, but might have executive functioning challenges. And I think that's to both of you for that question.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Boy, that's one of the most complex. And you see that for kids who are in 8th grade and transitioning a lot to high school. It's a real tricky thing to disclose to a child who may not know he or she has a disability, that some people think that they function in a way that's different than their peers might. And so, for example, younger children in elementary school who have resource room services that have learning disabilities, they know they are going to resource. They know they typically struggle with reading and writing or math. As you're getting a little bit older, middle school and high school age children, and especially with kids who have autism or ADHD type disorders, it's a real question to talk about with your child what his or her diagnosis is. I think it's appropriate to speak with a 12, 13-year-old about his or her diagnosis, to let them know that the services that they had received in school or outside of the school are because they need a little extra help or a lot of extra help in certain areas. Get their input, see if it's working, if they're able to communicate it well back to you. They may have completely different ideas about it. But I think for older kids, they soon realize that they have different teachers and that they sometimes have different services. So I think older middle school children, once kids go into high school, it's important to speak to them about what they're receiving and why they're receiving it. Does it mean you have this thing called an autism disorder or ADHD or an intellectual disability that might make learning a little bit difficult for you? Most children are okay with it. Parents should know who their children are, and if they need professional assistance. I speak a lot with young people between 12 and 15 about their diagnoses, and I am sometimes the first person who tells them that. And I spend a lot of time, talking to them about who they are, what their interests are, what these terms we call diagnoses or classifications are, and how they affect them. The one thing I would also say is, especially in high school, we see a lot of high schools wanting adolescent students to attend PPTs. I have very mixed feelings about that. I think some children are very proactive and like to participate. I think there's a lot of undue pressure on these students who feel markedly uncomfortable. We speak a lot and we hear a lot about the term self-advocacy. Well, sometimes self-advocacy is saying, I don't want to do this. Please. And now sometimes we can say, that's okay, you don't have to do this. And sometimes we say, well, we understand you don't have to do this. How can we help you? Because you have to do this. But we talk a lot about self-advocacy. And if a child is self-advocating and saying, I feel uncomfortable at this meeting, I think it's okay to be respectful of that. At schools, especially in high school, for many good intentions, really want the students there, but they are not always ready to be there. And I think that's something that parents need to be mindful of, and be mindful of who their child is. But we spend I think it's appropriate as children are 12, 13-year-olds to start to talk about what their needs might be in ways that they can understand it. Bring in an outside professional if you need to bring in an outside professional. And you can certainly bring in your school staff, because they know they have these conversations all the time with families and with students in school. But the real question is, how do you present the information? How do you make it both meaningful to the child, but not overwhelming to the child? We have to keep the child invested in participating in whatever we're asking him or her to do. But I think 12 to 14 is a very good age to start to have those conversations.
Yeah, agree with everything that Dr. Cohen said. I would just add that number one, parents of minor children make decisions for minor children, not school districts, parents do. So if you have a child under 18, you're in the driver's seat, you make a decision as to whether or not your child should be invited or attend a PPT meeting. Number two, I think parents are a fairly good reporter of what's going on in their child's life. And unless there's some reason to discount the veracity of the parent's information, they should be able to accurately convey what's going on in their child's life. How do they know that? They see their child getting ready for school. If there's school resistance, something's going on. They see their child after school. If there's a major meltdown after school, something is going on. If the school is reporting mastery of skills, there should be some generalization of skills from the school to the home. So the parents aren't, if not seeing that, something is going on. So I empower the parents of my clients, the students with disabilities. But there is a point in time, and Dr. Cohen talked about self-advocacy, that a student needs to start to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And in some cases, why do I have an IEP? Why do I learn differently? Why do I don't have any friends? Or why, all these why questions. As a matter of law in Connecticut, starting at age 14 for students with autism, they should be invited, but that doesn't mean they need to attend a PPT meeting to discuss transition services, preparing a student for life after high school. For students who do not have autism as a primary disability, starting around age 15, 16, the law requires that they be invited. Again, it's up to the parents to decide whether they should attend to discuss the transition services. And that's, because the purpose of special education, regardless of age of child, is to prepare that child, that student, for further education, for competitive employment and independent living if necessary, once they either graduate from high school or age out of special education. And from my perspective, you can never start too early with that. But the question is, overloading the child with information. So as Dr. Cohen said, be a good listener, find out what's on the student's mind, and then be prepared to bring that to the school's attention at informal meetings or at the formal PPT meetings.
Lawrence, I know that you have had experience too of districts maybe inviting a student to a meeting, but without giving the appropriate notice to the child or an opportunity for the child to be prepared to understand what the meeting might look like or might feel like. Are there any guidelines you could have to a parent that if they were thinking of inviting a child to a PPT, points that they should particularly help their child be aware of in terms of what to expect?
Well, again, it depends on the child. Some children, some older children in particular, students are in denial. You may have a problem, but I don't. Well, that student is not going to be an active participant in the meeting. I've been at PPT meetings, rare ones where the student shows up. They can't see past the end of their nose, whereas the parents and the others are looking at tomorrow, next year. The student is looking at the here and now. So it really depends. I haven't had many students offer constructive comments. Often when they're brought into the PPT meeting, they sit, they're polite, and they say, "Can I go back to my class?" This is an adult conversation, not necessarily a student. But they turn 18, the law says they're an adult, they should be involved most definitely at that point. So I think it should be a gradual process of integrating the concept of disability, strengths and weaknesses, the bureaucracy of an IEP, why we have these meetings, why we have triennial evaluations, and especially if the student is going off to college, and understand how high school is different than college. There is an IEP in high school. There is no IEP in college. So where do I go for supports? Well, no one is going to chase you down and say you have a Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock appointment with a school psychologist. You're not going to get a detention for skipping class in college. No one is going to chase you down and say, you know, you have 12 assignments that are past due. You're just going to flunk out of college. So these are hard, cold realities that are entirely preventable if everybody, the school, the family, the student, the college too, when they're there, are all buying into success.
Can I just add one quick thing? So when adults go to these meetings, especially if families have gone to a few PPT meetings, the school staff know what's going on. They've been to hundreds of these meetings frequently. The child is walking in, the young person's walking in, and there are 5 adults there, some who they know well, some who they don't know very well. The school principal might be there. It is a daunting, scary experience for some children. For some, it's great. They're doing performance art and they're fine. But for other children, the first time to do something like that, and as Mr. Berliner said, the kids are usually very polite, respectful, and usually ask to go back to class as quickly as they can. And so to prep your child, say, well, you might see a teacher you don't see too often. You might see the assistant principal, but you're not in trouble, because usually assistant principals associated with kids who have some difficulties during the school day, but you're not in trouble. If you see them here, you're actually here to be supportive of your needs the best they can. So really, really readying the child. But when I say that, you really, especially for the younger pre-18 kids, you really have to ready them and understand who your child is. Because I've seen a lot of kids who have just been so overwhelmed by the experience. And then just to add one quick thing, but Mr. Berliner said, I work with some children who have head injuries, and there's a term called neglect. And everything is fine to you, and you don't realize all the chaos that you're causing all around you. And so there's a few select kids who have head injuries or other neurological issues, and they'll spend the whole time arguing that everything is just fine. And you have to be careful about that also. Because if they're 18 and they're making that argument, they're going to be exited from services immediately, even if they still need services.
Well, that relates to a question that we received, which said, have you had children completely reject their disability and refuse the diagnosis and the support? And
not frequently, but yes. Not frequently. Usually there are a few clusters of children that it falls in with. Usually it's children with the higher ability intellectual disabilities. Usually it's children with some autism spectrum type of disorders. And frequently it's kids who have more depression disorders. No, and actually, I'll say a little earlier, kids who have psychiatric disorders where they perceive the world somewhat differently. That could be depression, that could be anxiety, but that could be other things as well. And so if they are in denial of their needs, that becomes a very tricky experience. In some cases, it becomes a very tricky legal experience, because the kids can have in school or out of school legal issues as well. So it does become a rather tricky thing. I think, again, if the child has those kind of presentations, is likely they've seen practitioners in the school, outside of the school, and it's good to have those practitioners help the student understand his or her special needs and sort of say, well, they may not say, well, gee, I get into fights all the time, but they might say, well, gee, why am I spending all the time in the principal's office, or why am I doing this or that? And it's not, why am I not doing the things I want to do? So sort of reframing it, helping them understand there are other options to get desired goals, as long as they're appropriate desired goals, legal especially. And so, you know, again, speaking with a child, taking time with your child, finding the appropriate professionals who might be helpful in explaining it to your child. But then there are some, you know, when I work with my adults who have head injuries, sometimes they're in complete denial, and they'll be in complete denial for the rest of their life. and everyone has to manage around their reactivities and their disregard of their own medical or mental status.
Yeah.
We have two questions involving transition, from transition from middle school and transition to high school. And both of them, the transition from middle school, the question is, should we invite the child's previous school to the PPT meeting? My answer is, don't assume anything. The only thing you can assume as a child, as a parent of a child with special needs, is you can't assume. So if you want somebody from the previous school, your child's current school, previous school, to attend the PPT meeting, ask the school district to invite those staff people to the meeting. The other one, for the transition from high school, what are my rights and what should I be looking for? Well, the rights don't change. The free appropriate public education standard is in effect from age 3, when special education starts, until either the student graduates from high school, or age 21 or 22, which is the current law based upon a federal court decision, which I won't discuss tonight. So what parents are looking for, well, just remember the transition plan, preparing the student for education after high school, preparing the student for competitive employment, and if necessary, preparing the students for independent. So how that's going to be delivered depends on the strengths and weaknesses of the student. So you, the family, and the student who's now in high school should have a pretty good idea of what you're looking for. Think 5 years down the road. Where do you want your child to be 5 years down the road? And then for the next 5 years, step by step, year by year, we're going to work towards those goals. If they're going to college, do they have the skills, the executive function skills, the time management skills, the organization skill, the self-advocacy skills? If it's employment, do they have the social skills, the pragmatic skills? What are the students' personal hygiene skills? Can they do? Can they manage money? Can they do laundry? How do they navigate, social conflict with, say, roommates? These are all things to consider. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It's what the family believes and the student believes, should be, in the IEP going forward. And then we have another question on transition. Somebody who's in a transition program, and because of COVID-19, they're not having the community-based jobs. Ironically, I had a PPT meeting this morning on that precise issue. I'm getting exhausted listening to COVID-19 being blamed for everything. We can't do this because of COVID-19. So I'm just going to repeat what the governor said. I think it's May 19th. The state of Connecticut is open. So as far as I'm concerned, students as of that date should have the same opportunity as students without disabilities to go out in the community, get part-time or full-time jobs, whatever they're doing. And if it's part of an IEP, that they should be in the community, accessing the community, and having jobs in the community. According to the governor, I think it was May 19th, May 1st is stage 1, and I think it's May 19th is the, basically we're reopened, maintain social distancing, have your vaccinations, wear masks, but other than those few safety protocols, which are necessary as we're still in this pandemic, I think a student should have, whatever they had before March of last year being delivered. So that's what I have to say in response to a couple of the questions. And then there's a question really for Dr. Cohen from a family who had a triennial evaluation for their child. Do you have any suggestions for that family on what they should be looking for in order to determine if the evaluation was comprehensive? And how could they determine whether there's a need for any additional assessments?
Boy, that's a good and tricky question at the same time. And usually a school district will have 2 or 3 providers completing the assessment. They'll have a resource teacher. And if the child is getting speech and language, the speech and language provider will participate, or the occupational therapist provider will participate. And there are a few questions to that. And one of the questions is the child making steady progress, not just towards his or her IEP goals, but in regard to the general education curriculum. So sometimes we see IEP goals that are somewhat different in terms of mastery of skill sets than the general education curriculum. Is your child meeting his or her general education requirements with the support he or she has? Is he or she meeting the special ed goals that he or she has? And that's been a little trickier this year. I've seen a lot of O's where I've never seen other markings ever before. I've seen half the IEPs I've seen this year have O's. But the other side of it is, I think assessment is vital. I do assessments professionally. You need to know where your child is developmentally. Cognitive intellectual testing is one of the best ways of determining the child's developmental status that we have, that is essentially neutral as these tests can be, and they are pretty good right now. And then you look at the areas of need. Is the child getting just resource room assistance? Well, is he or she mastering the reading goals that they're having? And you can tell that by giving a comprehensive reading assessment. We have very good ways of assessing. We have very good practitioners who assess reading, but we have very good assessment measures that assess all different kinds of reading sub-skills, or math sub-skills, or writing sub-skills. If the issue is a speech and language disorder, is the child very chatty, but his or her receptive language is below where it should be? We have very good ways of measuring these things in terms of the testing. And I would always ask before a child is discharged, especially if there's any question if the child should be discharged for services, to have a comprehensive assessment prior to discharge. The other area is if they're going to make substantive changes to an IEP, whether adding or removing services. Sometimes schools actually will add services for problems that parents don't think exist, and vice versa. Have an assessment. It's a little bit more time and a little bit more energy, but it really gives you, if it's done correctly, a lot of very good information to make a very good informed decision for your student, for your child. So I absolutely, for the triennials, in many cases, you don't have to do as much as you did the first time, or a comprehensive neuropsychological assessment. But if the questions change for the child, if the learning needs change for the child, sometimes I work with kids with medical conditions. If the medical needs change, sometimes I work with kids who have some family issues. And if the family issues change, you can see changes in that child's functioning, which limit their ability to access curriculum and instruction. So that's the important point. You have to match the assessment with where the issue is. And then you have to sort of be a little bit broad-based. Lots of times I see kids who are assessed with autism disorders in the school. Well, a child may not have an autism disorder, but they could have an anxiety disorder, or they could have a speech and language disorder. And you have to be prepared to ask the question, okay, we're glad our child doesn't have an autism disorder. Do they have these other things that may be getting in the way of their ability to access instruction? I think that's one of the places that schools are a little bit more limited in their assessments. And I think that's one of the places that private practitioners could be a little bit more expansive. But if you have worries, if your child's not accessing his or her classroom learning as they might, please do ask for a PPT meeting, ask to speak to your teachers, but then be involved with how you do the assessment plan, because that will really drive both what is done with your child, but it will also direct services. If you're doing an assessment plan that does not take into account underactive ADHD, what they might call the inattentive point type of ADHD, and the child has inattentive ADHD, you're going to miss it. If you are doing an assessment plan that of a child who's struggling in 3rd grade or 5th grade with his or her learning, if you're not looking at their emotional welfare, then you're not doing a full assessment either. We really need to see our children as whole functioning children, and we need to assess them that way.
But this links to one of the questions we just received, which is a COVID-19 Question. How can the school determine certain evaluations if a student didn't go to school consistently due to the restrictions of COVID-19?
Well, here's the simple answer to that is, with very rare exception, they're either having distance learning, hybrid learning, or in-class learning. And each of those mechanisms should be teaching the child at his or her level of development. There is some issues with distance learning. There are a few subsets of kids who have difficulty accessing computer screens for not preferred. A lot of the kids I work with love video games or movies and TV shows, including in my household. But my kids can also sustain an hour or 2 hours with a teacher, even if it's a class they don't necessarily prefer. What you need to do is figure out how to help your child access a non-preferred class. There are good ways of testing for that. But the other side of that is the child should be developing in his or her cognitive development no matter what. They should at least be maintaining academically. They shouldn't be regressing academically. And I don't think, as Mr. Berliner has alluded at different points, the fact that we've had a different way of teaching this year is a rationale for not ensuring that our children are developing appropriately. Now, they might be developing in a way that might be different than we might have hoped, but we still need it to be appropriate for that child or these groups of children. And I think there's been some controversy, for example, testing kids with autism in schools. I think we have done a disservice, for example, not doing direct assessments. I know other professionals have a different point of view than I do for that. Rating scales only go so far. I think schools substitute way too frequently rating scales for direct professional judgments and opinions and for direct professional interactions with a child. I'll see a report with 5 different rating scales in it. I get a headache. I don't know what it means anymore. And I read these things all the time. And usually when you get a test that has 5 different rating scales in it, they don't know what they're doing. Why are they doing it? It makes no sense to me. It rarely makes any sense at all. There should be a rationale for what you're doing. It should be easily and quickly explained. If you can't explain it fairly easily and quickly, you should really reconsider why you're doing it. But there has been an overabundant use of using rating scales. And I think there's been an overabundant use of using rating scales to not provide services. And I think that is a concern.
We have time for one last question, and that was addressed to me about the type of assessments that should be in a triennial evaluation for a high school student and for transition planning. The State Department of Education has, and the school district should be providing the Transition Bill of Rights. The Transition Bill of Rights cross-references another document called the Core Transition Skills. The core transition skills have about 15 more or less skills that the State Department of Education expects a child to have by the time they finish high school. So the type of assessments is critical. There are standardized assessments, there are normed reference assessments, there are situational assessments, there are curriculum-based assessments. The question is, what are you looking for? So if you have, the federal law requires that age-appropriate transition assessments be used. So if you have a child who's going on Naviance, a computer program at most high schools, that may be a good start, but that's not the ending point. So what I look at are, there are a variety of, there's something Enderly, the Vineland, the ABOS. There are a whole bunch of assessments of skills that can be used. I would start with the school district's transition coordinator and find out what kind of formal assessments, not observation alone, not curriculum-based assessment, because the curriculum-based assessment is assessing the student on the curriculum. We're talking about skills that are going to go beyond high school, beyond the high school curriculum: social skills, work skills, money management skills, transportation, if the student doesn't drive, how are they going to get around? Cooking skills, when to call 911. You know, you hear these stories, the police are called, the pizza is late. You just don't do that. You get yourself in trouble. So that's what I have to say. Look at the State Department of Education website. There are a lot of transition-oriented publications on the state website. One deals with the development of post-secondary goals and objectives. I just want to end with a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm very pleased to learn that Secretary Cardona from Connecticut has released the funding under the economic stimulus package that was signed last month. And Connecticut is slated to receive 1.105 billion with a B dollars that are going into our public education system. I hope that's going to make a difference. I hope much of that money will be allocated towards special education. And the U.S. Department of Education also has released their, what they call Volume 2 of the COVID-19 Handbook, a roadmap to reopening schools safely and meeting students' needs. This was also released this month. So there's a lot of information on the U.S. Department of Education website, ed.gov, the State Department of Education website, ct.gov. And lastly, what I want to say, actually second to last, there is a bill pending in our Connecticut General Assembly regarding a task force that analyze the implementation of laws governing instruction and training of children with dyslexia. It is House Bill 6517. Please contact your state representatives, your state senators, and urge them to move this bill forward, because right now it's stuck in the House of Representatives, and the General Assembly session will be ending soon, and we'd like to see that law implemented. So that's my second to last comment. My last comment is I want to thank Dr. Cohen for his time and participating in our webinar this evening. And I want to thank all the participants who have stayed with us to this late hour. Jane and I will be keeping a watchful eye on various developments in special education for the rest of this school year. If we will be scheduling another webinar. We don't have the date of the topic yet, but we will send out an announcement. And with that, I want to leave concluding remarks for both Dr. Cohen and for Jane Faherty.
I'd just like to thank Michael for coming tonight. It's been an invaluable conversation. We've had a lot of questions. Regrettably, we haven't had the time to necessarily answer all of your questions, but it just shows why we do these webinars, and we hope to answer some of the questions we couldn't tonight, maybe at the next webinar that we host. So thank you for staying with us. Thank you for asking fantastic questions. And Michael, thank you for sharing such in-depth, really valuable information.
Boy, it's been a real pleasure for me to participate. I'm so delighted that Attorney Berliner invited me and Jane invited me to participate. And hopefully next year I'll be able to participate again. I look forward to that. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all of our participants, and good night.
Great. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.